Good morning, class. Today we're going to do a demonstration of how to remove and install a spark plug. We're going to do spark plug service. Now, first step is to identify which spark plugs are which, or in which order. So here in this engine I have an inline 4-cylinder. How do I know it's an inline? Well, the engine is inline, it's straight, it's not a V, and there's 4 spark plug wires, so hence it's a 4-cylinder engine. Okay? So according to the Mitchell On Demand software program, they told me that this spark plug wire is number 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of tape here and I'm going to wrap it around that spark plug wire. Okay? So that when I remove it, I know that it goes back in this location. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to take my pen and I'm going to write down number 1. And that would be that this means this is number 2 and this is number 3 and this is number 4. Now you have to identify them all for your project. For this example, I'm only going to do 1, and the rest of them will be the same. So step 1, after identifying them, you have to take the spark plug boot off. And how do we do that? We take the spark plug boot by grabbing the boot, never the cable but the boot itself, and I twist it, make sure it moves. While twisting, I pull at the same time and it clips off. There we go. So I got that off nice and safe, and I'm going to put it to the side for now. Now you can see in the hole I have my spark plug itself. Okay? Now since the spark plug is sitting in a hole, a lot of times dirt and oil can accumulate in that hole. If I remove that spark plug without removing that dirt, what happens is all that dirt falls inside the engine and can damage the engine from the inside. So I'm going to get my air blower, which I did here. Okay? I'm going to grab my air hose, but before I do that I grab my safety glasses. And I always install my safety glasses before I use my air hose. Now, you're instructed taking the time to put up this little bulletin here on how to use the air hose. So let's follow it. It says how to operate the air hose. Getting started. Unwrap the hose and turn the upper blue ball valve to the on vertical position. So it says unwrap the hose. Okay. Take the upper blue ball valve, turn it vertical. Now connect the air line to the tool. So I take my air line to the tool, and it says make sure that the tool room manager has lubricated the tool with air tool oil, which the tool room manager has. And don't forget my safety glass. So I'm going to connect them simply by pushing the two together, and I'll hear them click in place. There we go. There's no twisting needed or screwing or tightening or anything, just clip in place. Now it also states here, never leave the tool connected to the air line when not in use, such as this. And the reason why we don't do that is if somebody were to walk by and trip over this hose, that tool would smack and hit the ground and that would damage the tool permanently. Of course, we'd have to replace it. It becomes expensive. When I'm not using the tool, I disconnect it, put the tool on the bench, and the hose is separate from it. Okay? So let's go ahead and use my air hose now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my air blower and I'm going to blow in and around the spark plug before I remove it, to remove that dirt. Okay, like so, nice and clean. Okay, have your instructor inspect. Alright, next step is to remove the spark plug. Now, to remove the spark plug, there's several different types of tools we can use here. So here I have 2 different types of spark plug sockets. Okay, here I have an impact flex socket, which this is the ideal spark plug socket which you want to use. But in some cases, because of its size, it might not fit in that location. Then we have the chrome spark plug socket, which is this is not bad, but it's not ideal. When we use the flex socket, we're going to use an extension. We use an extension, a normal extension. Nothing's fancy about this, and we always line up the detemp ball with the hole. When we use the chrome spark plug socket, I use a wobble extension. And you notice how the extension is rounded on the end. And the reason why that is to allow a little bit of flex in the socket. If we don't have this flex in the socket, we can very easily break the spark plugs while removing or installing them. Okay? We don't need that on this spark plug socket because it naturally flexes on its own. Okay? So let's see if this one fits. This is the preferred spark plug socket. And we're good, it does fit, okay? So anytime I connect my spark plug socket to my spark plug, I always do it without the ratchet in my hand. So anytime I connect it, I always do it without the ratchet attached, so to make sure I get in all the way and it's locked in place. I can do that easier without the tool there. Now, I have 2 different types of ratchets that'll fit on my extension here. Here's a standard 3/8 drive ratchet, which will work just fine. But this flex ratchet is what is suggested when using spark plugs. Actually, a lot of times if you were to go to the store and buy this ratchet, it's called a spark plug ratchet. So we're going to use this flex ratchet, the spark plug ratchet, on these spark plugs. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. Okay, now that I've connected the ratchet, well, before I loosen the ratchet, I have to support the head with one hand and then use the handle to turn on the other hand. But before I go and do that, I want to practice on Mr. or Mrs. Jug. Well, here I'm going to use my other anti-seize container. Now, which way do I loosen? To the left or to the right? Well, I can practice on this, because if I practice on this and get it wrong, I'm not going to damage anything. Where if I do this and I get it wrong, I'll damage the spark plug, but even worse, I'll damage the engine. And the engine, it's not a simple component you can replace. You have to replace the engine or do severe repairs. So let's practice on this guy. So if I'm going to turn in this direction, I'm going to ask myself, is that tightening or loosening? So let's see what we can do. I can see that I'm having a hard time turning that. It won't move, okay? So that doesn't seem right. So let's try the opposite direction. Oh, there we go. It's moving, and what do I know? It's loosening. So clearly, this direction, left to the left, is the correct way of loosening. And I always like to keep a bottle around to test on. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we go. So I go ahead and loosen my spark plug. Very easy to do. Once I have it, I can pull it out and I can examine the tip. And this is the business end of the spark plug. We're examining the tip of the spark plug for a few things. What we're doing is we're examining it for obviously if the engine's burning oil, if it's burning some coolant, if it's burning excessive fuel, if it's burning too hot, or if it's burning too cold. So this spark plug seems to be wearing properly, okay, and it looks good. And how would I know that? Well, I have to compare that against the manual in the classroom. So I'll take this spark plug upstairs and I'll compare it against the manual, and the manual has some colored photographs and it tells you a description of what that spark plug it has, what kind of problem it has. Okay, so before I reinstall that spark plug, there's a few things I have to do. Obviously, I have to show my instructor, hey, I removed the spark plugs, I've already identified them, this is the problem with the engine. And once I've done that, now I can continue on and I can gap the spark plug. What gapping a spark plug is, students, is you see how there's a gap between these two parts. This is the ground prong and this is the electrode, okay? And there's a space in between the two. And what happens in that space is actually a spark. And if the spark plug gap is too large, then the spark becomes weak and we can't burn all the fuel. If the spark plug gap is too narrow, then again, same thing. All the fuel around it, it'll only burn a small amount of fuel around the spark plug. So we have to get the ideal gap. And each gap is different for every car, every year, and every model. They're all different. So how would I find out? I look in the Mitchell On Demand and I find out what the correct gap setting is. And I've already done that. And I can test my spark plug gap. And this one is supposed to be 0.045. And you can see here that the gap is a little bit too large, okay? So what I need to do is I need to narrow that gap. Well, I don't want to be aggressive. I don't want to hammer it down. Well, I can use the other spark plug gapping tool, and it's here. And there's another way of testing. This is another type of spark plug gapping tool, and you can see here that this wire here, and it states right there, this is 0.045, which is the ideal for this type of engine. And I can run over here. You can see it moves in there too easily. Okay, since it moves in there too easily, there's too much space. So what I need to do is I grab this end of the spark plug gap gauge, okay, and I put it on here like so, and I bend it down slightly. And by doing that, it'll close the gap points just enough where I can test it on my gap gauge here. There, I have a slight resistance. That's perfect. That's the ideal. Let's double check with the other spark plug gap gauge. Okay, and we're good, 0.45. Now, if I needed to make it larger, what we should not do is force it around the gap gauge because it'll damage the metal in the gap gauge. This metal is not very tough. It's not as dense as this metal, so you'll damage this, okay? If you want to make it larger, what you need to do is you need to grab this guy again, and you need to bend it backwards like so, okay? And bending it backwards will open up the gap, and then bending it forward will close the gap, okay? Once that's done, obviously have my instructor inspect. My instructor has inspected my spark plug gaps, all of them. He or she has okayed them. So I'm going to take my spark plug and I'm going to put some antiseize on it. Now, this spark plug, is this is a copper core spark plug, and the outside is made of plain Jane steel. Now this is threaded into an aluminum cylinder head on this engine. Since the metals are different, when two metals touch each other and they're different, we always have a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction usually results in rust or corrosion. We don't want that to happen. I don't want the spark plug to rust inside the cylinder head of this engine. If that happens, I can never remove it, and I can never service this engine, and in a short period of time I'm going to have to throw the engine out. So what I do is I take my antiseize, and it's kind of a messy stuff. Now this stuff here is lead based. This is a silver antiseize, lead based, and there's other ones you can buy, nickel based or copper based. I like the lead based because it handles quite a high temperature of heat. We're going to put a little bit on the threads. I don't want to put any on the business end of the spark plug, because antiseize, or the lead in the antiseize, can damage the O2 sensor, which is in the exhaust if we try to burn this, and the catalytic converter, which is an emission component in the exhaust as well. So we have to put only some on the threads. Now I don't like putting too much. I just put a small amount here, just like so. And the reason why I don't go all the way around is because as I put the spark plug in and I start to thread it in there, it'll spread itself around, okay? So that's sufficient amount of antiseize. You see, just a small amount, that'll be enough. So I take that, and I'm going to install my spark plug, not with my tool, because if I install it with my tool, there's a good possibility I can cross-thread the threads in the cylinder head. Now, if I cross-thread the threads in the cylinder head, then that means I have to replace the cylinder head. And that can cost you up to around $3,000. Very expensive. So we're not going to do that. The proper way of installing it is with this installation boot. I put the spark plug on the end of the installation boot, and if I have a problem, if it gets in there and I can't, if I have a tool, it's very hard to feel if the threads are going in properly or not. Whereas with this, it won't allow me to turn it if there is an issue. You can clearly see here. Okay, so I'm going to take that, I'm going to install it into the hole. I'm going to thread it in as far as I can. And I'm going to show my instructor that I'm installing it with the rubber boot. I'm not using the tool. Very, very important. So once I feel that it's all the way in, and it's all done by feeling, just like so. Now I feel the resistance. Take my rubber boot off. Take my spark plug socket with the extension and the ratchet. Remove the ratchet. I no longer need the ratchet. I'm going to install my spark plug socket on the spark plug itself. I'm going to get my torque wrench. Now this is a 3/8 drive torque wrench. We need to torque that socket like we torque the wheel nuts. We have to tighten it with specific manufacturer specifications. Now the Mitchell on demand, you'll find that specifications on the Mitchell. Okay, so I put that on there, and I'm going to support the head of the torque wrench so it doesn't wobble back and forth. I'm going to use my other hand here, and I'm going to turn until I reach my specifications. And on this vehicle here, my specifications are 15 foot-pounds of torque. So I'm going to keep on turning. You can see how the needle is moving. I've hit 10 there, and I've hit 15 right there. Now nothing's stopping me from continually turning this socket, but this gauge is telling me I'm at the specs. I don't want to continue turning. If I do, I stretch the threads too much, and again I can damage them and damage the cylinder head. Very expensive to repair. So once that's in, I'm going to have my instructor inspect that I've torqued the spark plug to the correct settings. Then I'm going to take my spark plug wire. Remember, they're numbered, so we can't mix them up. And I'm going to place it back on the spark plug. And how do I know I'm down all the way? It clicks in place. You can feel it snap in place. And let's see if we can hear that. Okay, so it clicked in place. Once that's done, I'm going to show my instructor that they're properly installed. I'm going to remove my tape so that the next group can start fresh. That's it. Congratulations. You have successfully serviced the spark plugs.